The morning air in Millbrook was cold enough to bite through a thin jacket, and Elena Rowe pulled her coat tighter as she unlocked the front door of the Cedar Spoon Diner. She was 26, tired in the way only people who work 2 jobs could understand, and she had exactly $11 left in her bank account. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was that the coffee machine needed to be turned on, the chairs needed to come off the tables, and in less than 20 minutes the first customers of the day would start walking through that door, expecting a smile she did not always feel like giving. She moved through the diner with practiced ease, flipping light switches, wiping down counters that were already clean, checking that the napkin dispensers were full. This was her 3rd year working at the Cedar Spoon, and she had long since memorized every creak in the floorboards, every rattle in the old ceiling fans, every regular customer's favorite order. It was not a glamorous life, but it was hers, and she took pride in doing it well. By 7 in the morning, the diner had its usual rush of truck drivers and early shift workers. Elena poured coffee, took orders, and balanced 4 plates on her arms without spilling a drop. Her manager, a heavy-set man named Gerald, barked instructions from behind the register, and she nodded along without really listening, because she already knew what needed to be done. It was during a brief lull, somewhere around 9:30, that the bell above the door chimed, and an elderly woman walked in alone. She was small in stature, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a coat that looked expensive but understated, the kind of clothing that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. She moved slowly, leaning slightly on a wooden cane, and there was something in the way she carried herself that made Elena pause for half a second before approaching her table. "Good morning," Elena said, offering the same warm smile she gave every customer. "Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" The old woman looked up, and her eyes were sharp despite her age, a pale blue that seemed to study Elena carefully before softening. "Just tea, dear. Chamomile if you have it." "We do," Elena said. "I'll bring that right out." She returned a few minutes later with a small teapot and a cup, setting them down carefully. The old woman thanked her with a nod, and Elena might have simply moved on to her next table, except something made her linger. "Are you waiting for someone?" Elena asked, glancing at the empty seat across from the woman. "My driver stepped out to make a call," the woman said. "He worries too much. I told him I could sit alone for 10 minutes without the world ending." Elena laughed softly. "I understand that. My grandmother used to say the same thing to my mother." "Smart woman, your grandmother." "She was," Elena said, and something in her voice must have carried a trace of sadness, because the old woman's expression shifted, growing gentler. "Gone now?" "2 years ago." "I'm sorry, dear." The woman poured her tea slowly. "It is a strange thing, growing old. You spend so much of your life waiting for wisdom to come, and by the time it arrives, you have already lost the people you most wanted to share it with." Elena did not know why those words struck her the way they did, but she found herself sitting down for just a moment in the empty chair across from the woman, ignoring the small voice in her head that reminded her Gerald did not like her chatting during shifts. "That's a beautiful way to put it," Elena said. "I have had a long time to think about such things." The woman studied her for a moment. "You have kind eyes. Not many people do anymore. Most people look at me and see an old woman taking up space. You looked at me and saw a person." Elena felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Everyone deserves to be seen, I think, especially the people who get overlooked." The old woman smiled, and it was a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "What is your name?" Elena Rowe." "I am Margareta," the woman said. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Elena." They spoke for a few more minutes, Elena checking occasionally on her other tables, but always drifting back to Margaretha's corner booth. There was an ease to the conversation that surprised her, a comfort she rarely felt with strangers. Margaretha asked about her family, about her dreams, about whether she liked working at the diner. Elena found herself answering honestly, telling her about her mother's medical bills, about the night classes she was trying to take, about the small apartment she shared with her younger brother. "You carry a great deal on your shoulders," Margareta observed. "Everyone does, in their own way," Elena replied. "Not everyone carries it with grace." Before Elena could respond, the bell above the door chimed again, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, scanning the diner quickly. Before his eyes landed on Margareta, he looked apologetic, hurrying over to the booth. "My apologies, madam. The call took longer than expected." "It is fine, Corwin," Margaretha said, waving a dismissive hand. "I was in good company." The man, Corwin, glanced at Elena with a polite nod, and Elena returned to her other duties, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, though her mind kept drifting back to the strange warmth of that brief conversation. There had been something different about Margaretha, something that felt important, though Elena could not have said why. The diner continued its steady rhythm through the late morning. Elena moved between tables, her tray balanced expertly, her smile never faltering, even as her feet began to ache. She checked on Margaretha's table twice more, refilling her tea and asking if she needed anything else, and each time the old woman thanked her with genuine warmth, as though Elena's small kindnesses meant more to her than they should have. At one point, while Elena was clearing a nearby table, she overheard Corwin speaking quietly into his phone, his voice low and clipped. She could not make out the words, but something about his tone made her glance over, a flicker of unease crossing her mind, before she dismissed it as none of her business. People had private conversations all the time. It was not her place to wonder about them. Still, there was something about Margaretha that stayed with her. Perhaps it was the way she spoke, with a quiet authority that suggested she was used to being listened to. Perhaps it was the fine quality of her coat, or the way Corwin treated her with such careful deference. Elena did not know who this woman was, only that meeting her felt significant in a way she could not quite explain. Around 11, the diner grew busier again, as the lunch crowd began to trickle in. Elena moved faster, taking orders, delivering plates, making change at the register when Gerald stepped away. She barely had time to think about anything beyond the next order, the next table, the next smile she needed to offer a tired customer. It was in the middle of this rush, as Elena carried a tray of plates toward a table near the window, that she noticed a black car pull into the parking lot outside, parking at an angle that seemed slightly too deliberate, slightly too careful. She did not think much of it at the time. Cars parked in strange ways all the time in a lot as cramped as the diners. She delivered her plates, exchanged pleasantries with the table of construction workers, and turned back toward the kitchen to grab the next order. As she passed Margaretha's booth, the old woman looked up at her with an expression Elena would later remember as strangely peaceful, as though she had no worries at all in that moment, sitting in a diner sipping tea with a young waitress she had only just met. "You should sit with me again before I leave," Margaretha said. "I find I quite enjoy your company, Elena." "I would like that," Elena said, meaning it. She had no way of knowing, as she smiled and turned back toward the kitchen, that within the next few minutes, everything about this ordinary morning would be shattered beyond recognition. She had no way of knowing that the black car in the parking lot was not parked at a strange angle by accident, or that the men inside it were watching the diner with a patience that had nothing to do with hunger. Elena disappeared into the kitchen, calling out an order to the cook, laughing at something one of her co-workers said, entirely unaware that fate had already set something terrible into motion, something that would test every ounce of courage she did not yet know she possessed. The diner continued its comfortable hum of clattering plates and murmured conversations, the smell of bacon and coffee filling the air, sunlight streaming through the windows in warm golden bars. It was, in every visible way, a perfectly ordinary day. But ordinary days, Elena would soon learn, could turn in an instant. The first sign that something was wrong came from Corwin, who had grown increasingly tense over the past several minutes, his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes darting toward the parking lot every few seconds. He rose from his seat near Margaretha's booth, his hand instinctively going to his jacket, and there was a hardness in his expression that had not been there before. "Madam," he said quietly, leaning down toward Margaretha, "I think we should leave now." "Whatever for?" Margaretha asked, setting down her teacup. "I have not finished my tea." "Please," Corwin said, and something in his voice made even the old woman pause. Elena, returning from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, noticed the shift in atmosphere immediately. Corwin's posture had changed entirely, his relaxed demeanor replaced by something coiled and alert. She slowed her steps, glancing toward the parking lot herself, and saw the black car's doors opening. 3 men stepped out, moving with a purpose that made Elena's stomach tighten. They wore plain, dark clothing, nothing that would draw attention on a normal day, but their movements were too coordinated, too deliberate, like soldiers rather than customers. "Elena," Margaretha said suddenly, her voice calm but firm, "perhaps you should step back into the kitchen, dear." Elena did not move. Something about the urgency in the old woman's tone rooted her in place, even as every instinct told her to run. She watched as Corwin positioned himself slightly in front of Margaretha's booth, his hand disappearing into his jacket. The diner's other patrons had not yet noticed anything unusual, still eating their lunches, still chatting about their ordinary lives. Gerald was at the register, counting bills, oblivious to the tension building near the window booth. The cook in the kitchen continued flipping eggs, whistling along to the radio. It was, for a few more seconds, still an ordinary day. Then the front door burst open, and the ordinary day ended. The three men from the parking lot entered fast, their expressions blank and businesslike, and Elena's world narrowed to a single, terrifying realization. Whatever was about to happen, it was aimed directly at the sweet, silver-haired woman sitting in the corner booth, sipping chamomile tea, who only moments ago had told Elena she had kind eyes. Elena's body moved before her mind caught up. Later, she would try to explain it to herself, and never quite manage it, the way instinct had simply taken over, the way 26 years of choices had somehow narrowed down to this single, unthinking moment of motion. She dropped the coffee pot. She heard it shatter against the tile floor, heard the gasps of nearby customers, heard Gerald shout something from behind the register. None of it mattered. Her legs were already carrying her toward Margaretha's booth, toward the old woman who was struggling to rise from her seat, toward Corwin who was reaching for something inside his jacket but was not fast enough, was never going to be fast enough, because the men were already raising their weapons and the diner had gone silent in that horrible way that precedes chaos. Elena would remember, in fragments, what happened next. She would remember throwing herself forward, wrapping her arms around Margaretha's frail shoulders, pulling the old woman down and to the side, putting her own body between Margaretha and the door. She would remember the deafening sound that followed, a sound that did not seem real, that seemed to belong to some other, more violent world than the one she had woken up in that morning. She would remember Corwin shouting, remember the crash of overturned chairs, remember Margaretha's frightened voice calling her name. And she would remember, dimly, distantly, the strange heat that bloomed across her shoulder and her side, a heat that did not immediately register as pain, that felt instead like being struck very hard, like the wind being knocked from her lungs in 4 separate staggering waves. She did not let go of Margaretha, even as her knees buckled, even as the world tilted sideways, and the noise of the diner became a distant roar. She did not let go. She held on to the old woman with every last bit of strength her body had left, shielding her from whatever else might come. And the last coherent thought Elena had before darkness swallowed her whole was not about the pain, not about the fear, but about the simple, stubborn certainty that Margaretha needed to be safe. The diner had become a scene of pure chaos. Customers screamed and dove for cover beneath tables. Gerald was shouting into a phone, his voice cracking with panic as he begged for an ambulance. Corwin had managed to draw his weapon, exchanging fire with the intruders, his body angled protectively as he shouted for backup that was still minutes away. 2 of the attackers had already begun to retreat, realizing their target's guard had been faster than expected, while another fired one final shot before fleeing toward the black car still idling in the parking lot. Elena lay crumpled against the base of the booth, her body curled protectively around Margaretha's smaller frame, blood beginning to pool beneath her on the tile floor. Margaretha, shaking and disoriented but unharmed, stared down at the young waitress who had shielded her, whose face had gone pale, whose breathing had become shallow and uneven. "No," Margaretha whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, stay with me, child, stay with me." She pressed her trembling hands against Elena's side, trying uselessly to slow the bleeding, tears streaming down her weathered face. Around them, the diner continued its descent into panic, but Margaretha saw none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the young woman gasping weakly in her arms, the young woman who, 20 minutes earlier, had poured her tea and told her that everyone deserved to be seen. Corwin, having secured the immediate area, dropped to his knees beside them, already dialing for the fastest medical response he could summon, his voice sharp with an urgency that went beyond simple duty. He had seen violence before, he had seen death before, but something about the sight of this ordinary young woman, bleeding out on a diner floor because she had chosen, in an instant, to protect a stranger, struck him in a way few things ever had. "Hang on," he said, pressing his own jacket against her wounds. "Help is coming. Hang on." Elena's eyes fluttered, unfocused, searching weakly for Margaretta's face. The old woman leaned closer, gripping her hand. "You saved me," Margareta said, her voice thick with emotion. "You brave, foolish, wonderful girl. You saved me." Elena tried to speak, but no words came, only a faint, exhausted breath. Her eyes closed, and for a terrifying moment, Margareta feared the worst. Then, in the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with every passing second, racing toward the diner, where an ordinary waitress had just given everything to protect a woman she had known for less than an hour. What none of them yet knew, what would soon change everything, was exactly whose mother Margareta was, and what her son would do when he learned what had happened in that quiet diner, on an otherwise unremarkable morning. Draven Ashcombe was in the middle of a council meeting when his phone began ringing, with a tone reserved for only one contact, a tone that meant emergency, a tone he had not heard in years. He answered before the second ring finished, and the moment Corwin's voice reached his ear, shaking and clipped, the entire room fell away. "Say that again," Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There was an attack, sir. At the diner. 3 men. Unknown affiliation. Your mother is unharmed. I swear to you she is unharmed. But what, Corwin? There was a young woman. A waitress. She threw herself in front of your mother before I could react. She took the shots meant for her. She's alive, but barely, sir. They are taking her to Millbrook General now." Draven did not remember standing up. He did not remember the chair toppling backward, or the way every person in the meeting room fell silent, staring at him as though he had suddenly become someone else entirely. In truth, he had. The calm, composed alpha who ran meetings with measured authority had vanished, replaced by something older and far more dangerous, something that had not surfaced in a long time. "Get the car," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made 2 junior pack members flinch. "Now." He was in the vehicle within 90 seconds, his second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, sliding into the seat beside him without a word. Callum had served Draven for over a decade, and had learned, long ago, when silence was the wisest choice. This was one of those times. The drive to Millbrook General should have taken 25 minutes. Draven's driver made it in 12, weaving through traffic with a recklessness that would have terrified anyone unfamiliar with the urgency behind it. Draven sat rigid in the back seat, his hands clenched into fists on his knees, his jaw locked tight, his mind spinning through 1,000 possibilities, none of them acceptable. His mother. Someone had tried to kill his mother. He had spent years building defenses around her, ensuring she was protected wherever she went, and yet somehow, in the middle of an ordinary morning, in an ordinary diner she visited more often than his security detail liked, someone had managed to slip through every safeguard he had constructed. The rage building in his chest was almost unbearable, a rage that demanded action, demanded retribution, demanded answers immediately. But beneath that rage was something else, something quieter and more frightening. Fear. Not for himself. He had faced danger his entire life, and had long ago made peace with his own mortality. But the thought of losing his mother, the only family he had left after his father's death years earlier, was a thought he could not allow himself to fully process, not yet, not while there was still a chance to reach the hospital and find her alive and well. "Any updates?" Draven asked, his voice tight. Callum glanced at his phone. "Corwin says your mother is being examined now, purely as precaution. She insists she's unharmed. But sir, there's something else." "What?" "The waitress, the one who intervened. She's in critical condition. Multiple gunshot wounds. They rushed her into surgery the moment she arrived." Draven said nothing, staring out the window as the city blurred past. But something in Callum's words lodged itself in his chest and refused to move. A stranger, a young woman with no connection to their world, had thrown herself in front of gunfire to protect his mother. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know anything about her. And yet already, something about her selflessness struck him with a force he could not quite name. They arrived at the hospital in a blur of screeching tires and slamming doors. Draven moved through the entrance with the kind of authority that made hospital staff instinctively step aside, his presence commanding attention without him needing to say a word. He found Margareta in a private waiting room, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale, but her eyes clear and alert. And the moment she saw him, she rose from her seat and crossed the room in a few unsteady steps. Mother, Draven said, his voice cracking with a relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He pulled her into his arms carefully, as though she might shatter, though the doctors had already confirmed she had suffered no physical injuries. I am fine, Draven, Margaretha said, though her voice trembled. I am fine. But the girl, the waitress, she is not. Draven pulled back slightly, studying his mother's face. Tell me what happened. Margaretha recounted the morning in halting, emotional detail, her voice breaking as she described Elena's kindness, their conversation over tea, the way the young woman had smiled and spoken about her family, and then the sudden, violent intrusion, the way Elena had dropped everything and thrown herself forward without a moment's hesitation. She did not know me, Margaret said, tears slipping down her cheeks. She did not know who I was, what I meant to anyone, whether protecting me would matter to the world at all. She simply saw someone who needed protecting, and she acted. She could have run. She could have hidden. Instead, she chose to shield an old woman she had known for less than an hour. Draven felt something shift inside him as he listened, something he could not immediately identify. He had met countless people in his life who curried favor, who performed loyalty for personal gain, who calculated the cost and benefit of every action before committing to it. He had grown so accustomed to that calculation that he had nearly forgotten what genuine, unthinking selflessness looked like. Where is she now? He asked quietly. In surgery, Margaretha said. They would not tell me more. Draven, you must ensure she survives. You must ensure she receives the very best care this hospital can offer. I owe her my life. I will see to it personally, Draven said, and there was a promise in his voice that went beyond simple obligation. He left his mother in the care of 2 guards and made his way toward the surgical wing, where he found a cluster of doctors and administrators already gathering, alerted to his presence by hospital staff, who recognized the weight his name carried in this region. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His mere presence conveyed an expectation that would not be questioned. The young woman who was brought in with multiple gunshot wounds, Draven said. I want the best surgeons in this building working on her case. I want any specialist required flown in immediately if necessary. Cost is not a concern. Time is. The hospital administrator, a nervous man in his 50s, nodded quickly. Of course, sir. Dr. Whitfield is already leading her surgical team. He's the finest trauma surgeon we have. Then make sure he has everything he needs. Draven paced the hallway outside the operating room for what felt like hours, though it was closer to 90 minutes. Callum stood beside him for most of that time, occasionally offering updates from the PAC's intelligence team regarding the identity of the attackers, though early reports suggested the men had fled without leaving useful evidence behind. Draven listened with half his attention, his mind repeatedly circling back to the closed doors of the operating room, behind which a young woman he had never met was fighting for her life because of a choice she had made in less than a second. He thought about what it meant, that kind of instinct. He had built his entire reputation, his entire rule, on strength, on the ability to protect his people through power and fear and calculated strategy. He had never once considered that raw, unthinking compassion might be its own form of strength, perhaps a rarer and more valuable form than any he possessed. When Dr. Whitfield finally emerged from the operating room, pulling off his surgical gloves, his expression was cautiously optimistic, and Draven felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, for the first time since receiving Corwin's call. She made it through surgery, Dr. Whitfield said. It was close. One of the bullets came dangerously near her spine, and she lost a significant amount of blood before she arrived. But she is stable now. The next 48 hours will tell us more, but I am cautiously hopeful. Can I see her? Draven asked. She's unconscious, and will likely remain so for some time. But yes, you may sit with her if you wish. Draven followed the doctor into a recovery room, where Elena lay pale and still beneath a tangle of medical equipment, tubes and monitors surrounding her small frame. She looked younger than he had expected, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face peaceful, despite everything her body had endured. Draven stood at the foot of her bed for a long moment, simply looking at her, trying to reconcile the image of this fragile, unconscious young woman with the fierce, protective instinct that had led her to shield his mother from gunfire. Thank you, he said quietly, though she could not hear him. Whatever happens next, know that you will not be forgotten. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down, And though he had a kingdom's worth of responsibilities waiting for his attention, though his advisors were undoubtedly already gathering to discuss retaliation against whoever had orchestrated the attack, Draven found himself unwilling to leave her side. Something about the moment felt significant, as though he were witnessing the beginning of something he did not yet fully understand. Margaretha joined him an hour later, having insisted on being wheeled to the recovery room despite her guard's objections. She settled into a chair on the opposite side of Elena's bed, taking the young woman's limp hand in both of hers. "She reminds me of your father," Margaretha said softly. "He had that same kind of courage, the kind that does not stop to calculate risk before acting." Draven said nothing, watching Elena's chest rise and fall with slow, steady breaths, a small but undeniable proof of life. "You should rest, mother," he said eventually. "I will not leave her," Margaretha said firmly. "Not until I know she will wake." They sat together in silence for a long while, the steady beeping of medical monitors the only sound in the room, both of them keeping vigil over a young woman neither of them had known that morning, but whose fate had already become inseparable from their own. Outside the hospital, word was already beginning to spread through the PAX network. Whispers of what had happened at the diner, of the mysterious waitress who had thrown herself into the path of an assassination attempt, of the Alpha King who had rushed to the hospital and refused to leave. None of them yet knew how far this story would go, how completely it would reshape the lives of everyone involved, but the foundation had already been laid, quietly and irrevocably, in the space of a single terrifying morning. Draven remained at Elena's bedside long after the sun had set, refusing food, refusing rest, his mind turning over questions he could not yet answer. Who was this young woman really? What kind of life had shaped someone capable of such immediate, selfless courage? And why, as he watched her sleep, did he feel an unfamiliar pull in his chest, a sense that something important was unfolding, something that had nothing to do with politics or power or the endless calculations that governed the rest of his existence? He did not yet have a name for the feeling, but he suspected, as the hours passed and Elena's condition slowly stabilized, that he would not be able to ignore it for long. 3 days passed before Elena opened her eyes. The first thing she became aware of was a dull, persistent ache spreading across her side and shoulder, followed by an unfamiliar softness beneath her, sheets far more comfortable than anything she owned. Then came the steady beeping of a machine somewhere nearby, and the low murmur of voices, one of them unfamiliar and deep, carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire room even at a whisper. She blinked slowly, her vision blurry, adjusting to the dim light filtering through half-closed blinds. A private hospital room came into focus around her, far nicer than she would have expected, with soft furnishings and an arrangement of flowers on a side table that must have cost more than a week of her wages. "She's waking," a voice said, and Elena turned her head slightly to see Margaretha seated beside her bed, her face lighting up with relief. "Elena," Margaretha said, gripping her hand gently. "Oh, thank goodness. You gave us all such a fright, child." Elena tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw. A nurse appeared quickly, offering water through a straw, and Elena drank gratefully, her mind still foggy, pieces of memory returning slowly, like fragments of a dream she could not fully grasp. The diner, the men in dark clothing, the terrible noise, Margaret's frightened voice. "You're safe," Elena managed to whisper. "You're okay?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I am more than okay, thanks entirely to you. You saved my life, Elena." "You do not yet understand what that means, but you will." Elena frowned in confusion, and it was then that she noticed the second figure in the room, standing near the window, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter despite her exhaustion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark tailored suit that seemed almost out of place in a hospital room, his features sharp and striking, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not quite read. "Who?" Elena started, then stopped, too weak to finish the question. "This is my son," Margaret said, glancing toward the man with obvious affection. "Draven." Draven stepped closer to the bed, and Elena felt a strange, involuntary awareness settle over her, a sense that this man was not simply someone's son, that there was something significant about him that she could not yet place. He did not smile, but his expression held something close to gratitude, mixed with a wariness she found difficult to interpret. "You saved my mother's life," he said, his voice low and steady. I do not have adequate words to express what that means to me. I just... Elena swallowed, her throat still sore. I just reacted. Anyone would have done the same. No, Draven said firmly. Not anyone. Most people would have run. You did not. Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, letting her gaze drift back to Margareta, whose hand remained wrapped around hers. How long have I been here? Elena asked. 3 days, Margareta said. The doctors were uncertain for a while, but you fought through it. You are remarkably strong, Elena. 3 days. Elena's mind immediately jumped to practical concerns, the kind that had shaped her entire adult life, her shifts at the diner, her rent, her brother Miles, who was likely worried sick about her absence, the medical bills that were surely accumulating with every hour she spent in this clearly expensive private room. I need to call my brother, Elena said, trying to sit up, wincing immediately at the sharp pain that shot through her side. Please, do not strain yourself, Draven said, moving forward instinctively as though to stop her, though he stopped short of touching her. Your brother has already been informed. He has been here twice to see you while you were unconscious. He is safe, and has been told you are recovering. You contacted him? Elena asked, surprised. Of course, Margareta said. We would not leave your family wondering what happened to you. Elena studied the two of them, the elegant, aged woman whose life she had protected, and the striking, commanding man who watched her with an intensity that unsettled her in ways she could not fully name. Something about their manner, the deference of the hospital staff, the private room, the flowers, the sheer scale of attention being given to her recovery, told Elena that these were not ordinary people, but she did not yet understand exactly who they were, or why it seemed to matter so much. I don't understand, Elena said slowly. Why does this feel like such a big deal? I mean, I'm grateful you're both being so kind, but this room, the doctors, all of this seems like more than a simple diner customer would provide, Margareta finished gently. You are right to notice, dear. There is something I should explain to you. Margareta glanced at her son, who gave a small nod, and then she turned back to Elena, her expression growing serious. My son is not simply a businessman, Elena. He holds significant authority in this region, authority that comes with both privilege and considerable danger. The men who attacked us in that diner were not random criminals. They were sent, deliberately, to harm me, because harming me would harm my son, and harming my son serves the interests of certain people who oppose the way he leads. Elena's brow furrowed, trying to process this information through the fog of exhaustion and painkillers still lingering in her system. Leads what exactly? An organization, Draven said carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. One with a great deal of influence, one with enemies who do not hesitate to use violence to achieve their goals. My mother was a target, specifically because she is my mother. And you, Elena, without knowing any of this, without any obligation to do so, chose to place your own body between her and that violence. Elena absorbed this slowly, the pieces settling into place with a weight that made her chest tighten. She had saved the life of someone connected to genuine, organized danger. Someone whose family carried enemies capable of orchestrating an assassination attempt in broad daylight. The realization was dizzying, and beneath it lurked a quiet unease she did not yet have words for. I didn't know any of that, Elena said quietly. I just saw someone who needed help. That is precisely what makes what you did so remarkable, Draven said. You acted without calculation, without knowledge of the stakes, purely because it was the right thing to do. That kind of courage is rare, Elena. Rarer than you know. There was a weight in his voice that Elena did not fully understand, a gravity that seemed to carry more meaning than the words themselves conveyed. She shifted uncomfortably beneath his gaze, unsure how to respond to the intensity radiating from him. I appreciate everything you've both done for me, Elena said carefully, but I really do need to get back to my life, my job, my brother, my responsibilities. I can't stay in a hospital forever, and I definitely can't afford whatever this room is costing. You need not worry about cost, Draven said immediately. Every expense related to your care has already been handled, and will continue to be handled, for as long as necessary. That's incredibly generous, Elena said, but I don't want to be a burden, or a charity case. I'm grateful, truly, but I don't need. It is not charity, Margareta interrupted gently. It is gratitude, and it is also, I believe, the beginning of something my son has not yet fully explained to you. Elena glanced between them, confused by the strange energy passing between mother and son, an unspoken conversation happening entirely through glances and subtle expressions. Explained what? Elena asked. Draven hesitated, and for a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across his otherwise composed features. There are traditions within my world, Elena. Old customs that carry significant weight among my people. One of these traditions concerns what happens when someone outside our circle performs an act of extraordinary sacrifice on behalf of a leader's family. Elena's stomach tightened with a growing sense of unease. What kind of tradition? It is not something we need to discuss this very moment, Draven said, seeming to catch himself, perhaps recognizing that Elena, barely conscious for more than 20 minutes after days of unconsciousness, was not in a position to absorb whatever significant revelation he was building toward. You need rest. We can speak further once you have recovered more fully. Elena wanted to press the issue, some instinct telling her that whatever tradition he referred to carried consequences far beyond a simple thank you, but exhaustion was already pulling at her again, her eyelids growing heavy despite her efforts to stay alert. Please, she said weakly, just tell me my brother knows I'm okay. He knows, Margarethe assured her, and he will be able to visit again soon. For now, rest, Elena. You have earned it many times over. Elena's eyes drifted closed despite her resistance, the pull of exhausted sleep too strong to fight, and the last thing she registered before darkness claimed her again was the sensation of Draven's gaze remaining fixed on her, steady and unwavering, as though he were committing every detail of her face to memory. When she woke again several hours later, it was to find her brother Miles seated where Margarethe had been, his young face etched with worry and relief in equal measure. You scared the life out of me, Miles said, his voice cracking slightly. The hospital called and said you'd been shot. I thought. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I'm okay, Elena said, squeezing his hand as best she could. I promise, I'm okay. They told me some rich family is covering everything, Miles said, glancing around the room with wide eyes. This place looks like a hotel, not a hospital room. What's going on, Elena? Who are these people? Elena thought about the strange conversation with Margarethe and Draven, about the mention of traditions and customs and consequences she did not yet understand, and a small knot of apprehension formed in her chest. Honestly, she said slowly, I'm not entirely sure yet. But I think I'm about to find out. Outside the hospital room, unbeknownst to Elena, Draven stood in a private hallway speaking quietly with Callum and several senior members of his council, discussing the very tradition he had mentioned, a tradition that would soon reshape Elena's entire existence in ways she could not possibly anticipate. The council members exchanged uncertain glances as Draven spoke, some clearly skeptical, others cautiously intrigued, but none of them willing to openly challenge their Alpha King on a matter he had already, quietly and privately, decided upon. The wheels had already begun turning. Elena, resting in her hospital bed, blissfully unaware of the magnitude of what was coming, had no idea that her simple act of courage in a diner 3 days earlier had set into motion a chain of events that would soon place a crown, figuratively, and perhaps quite literally, upon her unsuspecting head. The council chamber inside Draven's estate was a long, austere room, with dark wood paneling and a table large enough to seat 20, though on this particular evening, only 6 senior members had been summoned, along with Callum, who stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with quiet attentiveness. You cannot be serious, said an older man named Percival, one of the longest-serving members of the council. The old law of the shielded bond has not been invoked in over a century. It exists as a historical curiosity, not a practical framework for modern decisions. The law still stands, Draven said calmly, seated at the head of the table. It was never repealed. It simply fell out of use. With good reason, Percival argued. The law was designed for a different era, when packs were smaller, when bloodlines needed reinforcing through unexpected unions. Invoking it now, over a human waitress with no pack affiliation, no political standing, no, she took 4 bullets meant for my mother, Draven interrupted, his voice hardening, without hesitation, without knowledge of who we are, or what danger she was placing herself in. Tell me, Percival, When was the last time you saw an act of loyalty that pure from anyone within this council? The room fell silent. Percival's jaw tightened, but he did not immediately respond. Another council member, a sharp-eyed woman named Isolde, leaned forward. Loyalty is admirable, Draven, but the shielded bond is not simply a reward for bravery. It is a formal, binding declaration of marriage, recognized by pack law as unbreakable, except under the most extreme circumstances. You would be committing yourself, publicly and permanently, to a woman you met 3 days ago while she lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Have you considered what this means beyond gratitude? Draven's fingers tapped once against the table, the only outward sign of the storm of thoughts churning beneath his composed exterior. He had, in fact, considered very little beyond the raw instinct that had gripped him the moment he learned what Elena had done. It was not merely gratitude, though gratitude was certainly part of it. It was something harder to articulate, a recognition of character that he rarely encountered among the calculating, self-interested people who typically surrounded him. I have considered it, he said finally. And I believe the law exists precisely for moments like this one, a moment when someone outside our world proves themselves worthy of belonging within it, not through birthright or political maneuvering, but through genuine, demonstrated character. And if she refuses, Isolde asked, the law grants you the right to declare the bond, Draven, but it does not force her hand. If this young woman wants nothing to do with our world, with the danger and complexity that comes with it, what then? Then I will respect her wishes, Draven said, though something in his tone suggested he had not fully considered this possibility, or perhaps had considered it and found it deeply unsettling. But I do not intend to let this opportunity pass without at least offering her the choice. Percival shook his head slowly. There will be those within the pack who resent this decision, Draven. A human, elevated to such a position, without proper vetting, without political alliance, based solely on a single act of courage, however admirable, you will face resistance. I have faced resistance before, Draven said, his gaze steady. I will face it again if necessary. This decision is mine to make, and I have made it. Callum, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke from his position near the door. If I may, sir, the pack has grown weary of politics and calculated alliances. Perhaps a leader who chooses based on character rather than strategy will remind them of what genuine strength looks like. Draven glanced at his second-in-command, with something close to appreciation, and the room settled into an uneasy quiet, the council members exchanging glances that ranged from skeptical to cautiously supportive. The declaration will be made when she is well enough to understand its full weight, Draven said, rising from his seat, signaling the end of the discussion. Until then, her safety and recovery are the priority. I want additional security assigned to her hospital room immediately. Whoever ordered that attack knows now that their plan failed, and they may attempt to silence the woman who stopped them. The council members filed out slowly, murmuring among themselves, while Callum lingered behind, waiting until the room had emptied, before approaching Draven directly. You understand this will be complicated, Callum said quietly. She has no idea what she is walking into. A world of politics, danger, and expectation that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. I understand, Draven said. And you are prepared for the possibility that she says no. Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring at the empty council table, his mind returning unbidden to the image of Elena, lying pale and fragile in her hospital bed, the fierce determination still visible even in her unconscious state, as though her body remembered what her mind could not yet recall. I do not know, he admitted finally. I have never wanted anything to be accepted so badly in my entire life, and I have never been more uncertain of the outcome. Callum studied him for a long moment, something like surprise flickering across his features. He had served Draven for over a decade, and had rarely, if ever, heard him express uncertainty about anything. Then perhaps, Callum said carefully, this is exactly the kind of decision that matters most. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Elena's recovery continued steadily, under the careful attention of Dr. Whitfield and his team. Miles visited daily, bringing updates from her apartment, reassurances about her job, though he carefully avoided mentioning that Gerald had already replaced her position at the diner, unwilling to add stress to her recovery. He did not yet know the full extent of what Draven and Margaretha represented, only that they carried an unmistakable air of power, and had spared no expense in ensuring his sister received the finest possible care. Margareta visited often as well, sitting beside Elena's bed for hours at a time, sharing stories from her long life, asking questions about Elena's dreams and ambitions, growing genuinely fond of the young woman whose courage had saved her life. Their conversations deepened with each visit, moving beyond polite small talk into something resembling real friendship, and Elena found herself looking forward to Margareta's visits more than she cared to admit. Draven visited less frequently, but when he did appear, his presence filled the room in a way that left Elena feeling strangely unsettled, aware of him in a manner she could not fully explain. He rarely stayed long, often citing pressing responsibilities, but his eyes lingered on her each time he left, as though he were memorizing something he feared losing. One afternoon, nearly a week after she had first regained consciousness, Elena finally felt strong enough to ask the question that had been nagging at her since that first blurry conversation. "Margareta," she said, as the old woman settled into her usual chair beside the bed. "What did Draven mean? About traditions? About something being explained once I recovered more fully?" Margareta's expression grew thoughtful, and she took a long moment before answering, choosing her words with obvious care. "There is an old custom within our world," she said slowly, "one that recognizes acts of extraordinary sacrifice performed on behalf of a leader's family. It grants the leader the right to formally bond himself to the person who performs such an act, elevating them to a position of protection and honor within our community." Elena's brow furrowed. "Bond himself? What does that mean, exactly?" Margareta met her eyes steadily. "It means marriage, Elena. A binding, permanent union, recognized by our laws as unbreakable, except under the rarest circumstances." Elena felt the blood drain from her face, her mind reeling, as the full weight of Margareta's words settled over her. "Marriage? To Draven? Because I pushed you out of the way? Because you demonstrated a kind of loyalty and courage that our world values above almost anything else," Margaret said gently. "My son has already decided he intends to invoke this tradition, Elena. He intends to declare you his wife." Elena stared at her, stunned, the machines around her beeping steadily, as her heart rate spiked with the shock of the revelation. "That's insane. I don't even know him. I met him 3 days ago, while I was unconscious, apparently. I can't just marry a stranger because of some old tradition." "I understand this is overwhelming," Margaret said, reaching for Elena's hand. "But please understand, Elena. This decision belongs to you as much as to him. The law grants Draven the right to declare the bond, but it cannot force your acceptance. You will have a choice." "A choice," Elena repeated numbly. "This is all so much. I just wanted to serve coffee and tea, and go home to my brother. I didn't ask for any of this." "No," Margareta agreed softly. "You did not ask for any of it. You simply acted with a courage that changed everything, whether you intended it to or not. That is often how the most significant moments in life unfold, Elena. Not through careful planning, but through sudden, unexpected choices that reveal who we truly are." Elena sat in silence for a long while, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the enormity of what she had just been told. Somewhere beyond these hospital walls, a powerful man she barely knew intended to declare her his wife, based entirely on an instinct she had followed without a single moment of hesitation. The thought terrified her, and yet, buried somewhere beneath the fear, was a small, confusing flicker of curiosity she did not yet know how to name. She would need to face Draven soon, she realized, and when she did, she would need to decide what kind of life she truly wanted, and whether the strange, unexpected path opening before her was one she was brave enough to walk. Draven arrived that evening, later than usual, his expression carrying a weight Elena had not seen on him before. He entered quietly, nodding once to Margareta, who rose from her chair with a knowing look and excused herself, leaving the two of them alone for the first time since Elena had regained consciousness. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain, until Elena finally broke it. "Your mother told me," she said, "about the tradition, about what you intend to do." Draven's jaw tightened slightly, and he moved to stand near the window, his back partially turned to her, as though bracing himself for her reaction. "I imagine it must sound absurd to you, perhaps even frightening." "It sounds like a lot," Elena admitted honestly. "I don't understand how something like this can even exist. Marriage isn't a reward, Draven. It isn't something you can just declare because someone did something brave. You are right to question it, Draven said, turning to face her fully. I have asked myself the same thing repeatedly over these past several days, whether this tradition still holds meaning in a world that has changed so much since it was written, whether it is fair to you, a woman who owes my family nothing, to be thrust into a decision of this magnitude. Then why pursue it at all? Elena asked. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as though searching for the right words among a lifetime of careful, calculated speech that had never quite prepared him for a conversation like this one. Because I have spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who calculate every action for personal advantage, he said finally. Alliances built on strategy. Loyalty offered only when it serves ambition. I have grown so accustomed to that world that I nearly forgot what it looks like when someone acts purely from the heart, without calculation, without hesitation, simply because it is right. He took a step closer to her bed, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. You did that, Elena. You saw my mother, a stranger to you, in danger, and you did not stop to consider the risk to yourself. You acted. That kind of courage is rare in my world, rarer than power, rarer than wealth, rarer than any of the things people typically value. And when I learned what you had done, something in me recognized it immediately as something worth honoring, worth protecting, worth building a future around. Elena's throat tightened with emotion she had not expected to feel, though confusion still warred within her alongside it. But you don't know me, Draven. Not really. You know what I did in a moment of crisis. You don't know who I am on an ordinary Tuesday, what I care about, what I fear, what kind of person I actually am beyond that single moment. Then let me learn, Draven said, his voice softening. I am not asking you to accept this bond blindly, tonight, without understanding what it means or who I am. I am asking for the chance to know you, and for you to know me, before any final decision is made. The declaration I intend to make is not a demand, Elena. It is an offer, one you are free to decline. Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of manipulation, any calculated angle designed to pressure her into a decision she did not truly want, but she found none. Only a strange, unfamiliar vulnerability in a man who clearly was not accustomed to exposing himself this way. What happens if I decline? She asked. Then you decline, Draven said simply, and I will ensure you and your brother are protected, that your recovery is complete, that you return to your life with whatever support you require. I will not force this upon you, Elena. Whatever else people may say about the world I lead, I have never ruled through coercion, and I do not intend to start with you. Elena absorbed this, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly, though the enormity of the choice before her still weighed heavily. I need time, she said finally. This is too much to process while I'm still recovering from being shot 4 times, Draven. I can't make a decision like this from a hospital bed. Then take the time you need, Draven said. There is no urgency here, beyond what you require for yourself. He remained a while longer, and their conversation shifted gradually into more comfortable territory. Elena asking questions about his world, about the pack he led, about the responsibilities that came with his position. Draven answered honestly, describing the challenges of leadership, the constant political maneuvering required to maintain stability among factions that did not always agree, the isolation that came with a position few people could truly understand. In turn, Elena found herself sharing more about her own life than she had intended, the loss of her parents, the responsibility she had taken on for her younger brother, the dreams she had once held for herself before circumstances forced her into a more practical, survival-focused existence. Draven listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions, and Elena realized, somewhat to her surprise, that she was enjoying his company far more than she had expected to. Over the following days, as Elena's physical strength gradually returned, Draven visited more frequently, their conversations growing longer and more comfortable each time. He brought her books when she mentioned enjoying reading. He arranged for a physical therapist to help with her recovery once she was strong enough to begin gentle exercises. He listened when she expressed frustration about losing her job at the diner, and quietly, without fanfare, ensured Miles received support to cover their household expenses during her recovery, careful to frame it as assistance rather than charity, understanding intuitively that Elena's pride would resist anything that felt like pity. Margareta, meanwhile, continued her own visits, and a genuine friendship blossomed between the two women, one built on mutual respect and growing affection. Margareta often spoke fondly of Draven's childhood, of the man he had become despite the isolating pressures of leadership, painting a fuller picture of him than Elena might have otherwise glimpsed. "He is not always as composed as he appears," Margareta confided one afternoon. "Since his father passed, he has carried the weight of our entire community on his shoulders, often alone. He rarely allows himself vulnerability, Elena. The fact that he has shown you as much as he has speaks to something significant." "I still don't fully understand what he sees in me," Elena admitted, "beyond the accident of what happened at the diner." "It was not an accident," Margareta said firmly. "It was a choice, one that revealed exactly the kind of character my son has spent his entire life searching for, whether he realized it or not." As the days passed, Elena's recovery progressed steadily, and with it, her understanding of the world she had unexpectedly been drawn into deepened. She learned about the pack's structure, its history, the delicate balance of power that Draven navigated daily. She learned about the enemies who had orchestrated the attack, a rival faction seeking to destabilize Draven's leadership by striking at his family, and she began to understand the genuine danger that surrounded people in his position, danger that would now, inevitably, surround her as well, should she choose to accept the bond being offered. It was a heavy realization, one that kept her awake during quiet hospital nights, staring at the ceiling, weighing the life she had known against the uncertain, complicated future being offered to her. She thought of her parents, of the values they had instilled in her about kindness and courage, and doing what was right regardless of consequence. She thought of Miles, and what accepting this bond might mean for his safety, for his future. And she thought of Draven himself, the quiet vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his composed exterior, the genuine warmth that had grown between them over these strange, unexpected weeks. She did not yet know what she would decide, but she understood, with growing clarity, that whatever choice she made would reshape not only her own life, but the lives of everyone connected to her, in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Outside her hospital room, unbeknownst to Elena, the rival faction responsible for the attack had not given up their pursuit. Having failed once, they were already regrouping, formulating a new strategy, one that would soon place Elena directly in their crosshairs, not as an incidental casualty of an attack meant for someone else, but as a deliberate target in her own right. The danger that had once been distant and abstract was about to become immediate and personal, and Elena, still recovering from wounds meant to end another woman's life, would soon find herself forced to decide, far sooner than she had anticipated, exactly where her loyalties and her courage would lead her next. 2 weeks after the attack, Elena was discharged from the hospital, though her recovery remained far from complete. Draven had arranged for her to stay at a private residence on the outskirts of the city, a quiet estate surrounded by tall hedges and careful security, insisting it was simply a safer environment than her small apartment, while investigations into the attack continued. Elena had resisted at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being so entirely dependent on his generosity, but Miles had gently convinced her to accept, pointing out that neither of them could afford proper security on their own, and that refusing sensible protection out of stubborn pride helped no one. The estate was beautiful in a quiet, understated way, nothing like the ostentatious wealth Elena had imagined when she first learned of Draven's position. Simple, elegant furnishings, filled rooms with large windows that let in generous natural light, and a garden stretched behind the house, filled with flowering plants that Margareta apparently tended herself whenever she visited. It was in this garden, one warm afternoon nearly 3 weeks after the attack, that Draven found Elena sitting quietly on a stone bench, watching bees move lazily between blossoms, her expression thoughtful. "You look deep in thought," he said, settling onto the bench beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. "I've been thinking about everything," Elena admitted, "about what accepting this bond would actually mean, not just for me, but for you too. Your people, your council, they can't be thrilled about the idea of their alpha bonding himself to someone with no connection to your world. Some are not thrilled," Draven acknowledged honestly. "Change unsettles people, especially change that challenges long-held assumptions about how leadership and loyalty should function. But I have led long enough to know that the right decisions are not always the popular ones." "And you're certain this is the right decision?" Elena asked, turning to study his face. Not just an impulsive reaction to gratitude, but something you've truly thought through? Draven considered the question seriously before answering. I have thought of little else since the moment I learned what you did for my mother. And the more time I spend with you, Elena, the more certain I become that this is not simply about gratitude. It is about who you are. Your kindness, your resilience, the way you carry your responsibilities without complaint, the way you speak of your brother with such fierce protectiveness, the way you have handled being thrust into an unfamiliar and frightening world with more grace than most people raised within it managed to display. Elena felt her cheeks warm at his words, and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze under the weight of such open sincerity. I still have concerns, she admitted, about the danger, about whether I could ever truly belong in your world, about whether accepting this bond would mean giving up who I am to become something else entirely. You would never need to become someone else, Draven said firmly. Whatever else this bond might require, it does not require you to abandon your identity, your values, or the life you have built. If anything, I hope it would allow you to build an even fuller life, one where you are protected, valued, and free to pursue whatever dreams you set aside out of necessity. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps, and Callum appeared at the edge of the garden, his expression tense in a way that immediately put both Draven and Elena on alert. Sir, Callum said, glancing briefly at Elena before addressing Draven directly, we have received credible intelligence regarding another threat. This time, the target appears to be Elena herself. Elena's stomach dropped, a cold wave of fear washing over her. Me? Why would anyone target me? Because you have become a symbol, Callum explained grimly. Word has spread throughout our world about what happened at the diner, about the Alpha's intention to bond himself to you. Our enemies understand that eliminating you now would not only remove a witness to the failed attack, but would also strike a devastating blow against Draven personally, undermining his authority and demonstrating that even those under his direct protection are not truly safe. Draven's expression darkened, a barely restrained fury settling over his features. What is the nature of this threat? Intelligence suggests they intend to strike within the next several days, though we do not have specific details regarding timing or method, Callum said. I recommend increasing security around this estate immediately, and considering relocating Elena to a more secure location until we can neutralize the threat. Elena felt her hands trembling slightly, the reality of the danger surrounding her suddenly, viscerally clear, in a way it had not been while she recovered safely within hospital walls. This is because of what I did, isn't it? Because I saved Margareta. This is because of the actions of cowards who target the innocent to achieve their goals, Draven said sharply. None of this is your fault, Elena. You did the right thing, and you will not be punished for it while I have breath in my body to prevent it. I need to think about Miles, Elena said urgently. If they're targeting me, could they go after him too, to get to me? We will increase his protection immediately, Draven assured her. I will not allow harm to come to your brother. Callum departed to begin coordinating enhanced security measures, leaving Draven and Elena alone once more in the garden, though the peaceful atmosphere from moments earlier had been entirely shattered by the news. I'm frightened, Elena admitted quietly, an honesty she rarely allowed herself. Not just for myself, but for everyone around me. Miles, Margareta, even you. It feels like my life has become something I no longer recognize, all because of a single decision I made without even thinking. Draven reached for her hand then, gently, giving her the opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. I understand fear, Elena, he said quietly. I have lived with it my entire life, in one form or another. The fear of failing my people, of losing those I love, of making decisions that carry consequences I cannot always predict. But I have also learned that fear, properly understood, does not have to control us. It can simply be acknowledged, respected, and then set aside in favor of action. What action would you suggest? Elena asked. Allow me to protect you fully, Draven said. Not as an obligation, not as charity, but because I want to, because your safety matters to me, beyond anything else I have prioritized in a very long time. And in return, perhaps consider more seriously what a future within my world might actually look like. Not out of fear, but because you have seen, over these past weeks, that it need not be defined solely by danger. Elena studied their joined hands for a long moment, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, the steadiness of his presence beside her despite the storm of danger swirling around them both. "I need to know something," she said finally. "If I accept this bond, and things become difficult, if your people continue to resist my presence in your world, if the danger continues, will you stand by me? Truly stand by me, not out of obligation, but because you actually want to?" Draven turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "Elena, I have led my people through wars, through betrayals, through losses that would have broken lesser men. I do not make commitments lightly, and I do not abandon those I have chosen to protect. If you accept this bond, I will stand beside you for as long as I draw breath, regardless of difficulty, regardless of resistance, regardless of danger." The sincerity in his voice settled something within Elena, a quiet certainty beginning to take root beneath the fear and uncertainty that had governed her thoughts for weeks. She was not yet ready to give him a final answer, not while active threats loomed over her and everyone she loved, but she understood, in that moment, that whatever answer she eventually gave would not be born from obligation or fear, but from something far more genuine. That evening, additional security personnel arrived at the estate, transforming the previously quiet property into a carefully guarded fortress. Miles was relocated to a secure apartment closer to the estate, under Draven's direct protection, and Margareta insisted on staying at the estate as well, unwilling to be separated from either her son or the young woman who had become so important to her. As night fell over the heavily guarded estate, Elena lay awake in her bedroom, listening to the distant murmur of security personnel patrolling the grounds, her mind turning over everything that had unfolded since that ordinary morning at the Cedar Spoon Diner. She thought of the choice awaiting her, the bond that would either be accepted or declined, the life that hung in the balance between the safety of everything familiar and the uncertain, complicated future being offered to her. She did not yet know that within the next 48 hours, the threat looming over her would become terrifyingly real, forcing her hand in ways she could not have anticipated, and ultimately revealing, in a moment of genuine crisis, exactly what kind of future she truly wanted, and exactly what kind of man Draven Ashcombe was willing to become in order to protect it. The attack came on the second night, quiet and calculated, nothing like the chaotic assault at the diner weeks earlier. Elena woke to the soft sound of her bedroom door creaking open, a sound that should not have been possible given the layers of security surrounding the estate. Her heart lurched immediately into her throat, adrenaline flooding her system as she sat up in the darkness, straining to see the shape moving toward her bed. She did not scream. Some instinct told her that screaming would only speed whatever was coming, and instead, she moved quickly, rolling off the far side of the bed and grabbing the heavy lamp from her nightstand, gripping it like a weapon as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. The intruder, a broad-shouldered figure dressed entirely in black, lunged toward where she had been lying only seconds earlier, clearly expecting to find her still in bed. Elena swung the lamp with all the strength her still-healing body could muster, catching the intruder across the shoulder, enough to stagger him but not enough to stop him entirely. "Help!" she shouted then, abandoning her earlier instinct towards silence, understanding that noise was now her best chance at survival. "Someone help me!" The intruder recovered quickly, lunging toward her again, but the delay had been enough. The bedroom door burst open, and two of Draven's security personnel rushed in, tackling the intruder before he could reach Elena a second time. What followed was a brief, brutal struggle, the security team subduing the attacker while shouting for backup, alarms beginning to blare throughout the estate as the entire security network activated. Elena stood pressed against the far wall, her chest heaving, the lamp still clutched in her trembling hands, watching as the intruder was restrained and hauled away, still struggling weakly against his captors. Within moments, Draven appeared in the doorway, his expression a mask of barely controlled fury, his eyes immediately scanning her for any sign of injury. "Elena," he said, crossing the room in a few long strides, his hands hovering near her shoulders, as though afraid to touch her, afraid perhaps of causing her further distress. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Elena said, though her voice shook noticeably. "I'm okay. He didn't reach me. I hit him with the lamp and then your people came in." Draven's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing visibly as he processed how close the attack had come to succeeding, how thin the margin between safety and catastrophe had truly been. "This should never have happened. Our security should have stopped him before he ever reached your room." But it didn't happen, Elena said, some of her own fear beginning to settle into a kind of stunned clarity. I'm safe. Margaretha? Is she? She is safe. Guarded in her room. Unaware of what has occurred, Draven said. I will explain everything to her once the situation is fully contained. Callum appeared moments later, his expression grim. We have him in custody, sir. Initial questioning suggests he was sent by the same faction responsible for the diner attack. He confirmed Elena was the primary target this time, intended as a message aimed directly at you. Draven's fists clenched at his sides, restrained violence radiating from his entire posture. Find out everything he knows. I want the full network responsible for this identified and dismantled, immediately. Callum nodded and departed swiftly, leaving Draven and Elena alone once more, amid the chaos of a security team, still securing the estate's perimeter. Elena finally allowed herself to lower the lamp, setting it down on the nightstand, with hands that still trembled from the aftermath of adrenaline. I could have died tonight, she said quietly, the reality of the situation settling over her with sudden, overwhelming clarity. In my sleep, in a house surrounded by armed guards, I nearly died. I know, Draven said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to display so openly. And I have never been more furious with myself for failing to anticipate the full extent of the danger you now face because of your connection to me. This isn't your fault, Elena said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. You didn't ask for this either, Draven. Your enemies did this, not you. Perhaps, Draven said, but you are in danger because of who I am, because of the world I have brought you into, however unintentionally. That is a burden I carry, regardless of where the blame ultimately lies. Elena studied him for a long moment, taking in the barely restrained anguish in his expression, the genuine anger and fear he clearly felt on her behalf, emotions that seemed to have little to do with obligation or tradition, and everything to do with something far more personal. I've made a decision, she said suddenly, the words leaving her before she had fully processed them, though somewhere deep within her, she recognized they had been building steadily over these past weeks. Draven went very still, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to hold his entire being suspended, waiting. Tonight, when I heard that door open, when I thought someone had come to kill me, my only thought wasn't regret about the choices that led me here, Elena continued. It was fear for the people I've come to care about, for Margaretha, for you, for what would happen to everyone if I wasn't here to see this through. And I realized, in that moment, that despite everything, despite the danger and the uncertainty, I don't regret the choice I made at that diner, and I don't think I regret the path it's led me down since. Elena, Draven said carefully, you do not need to decide anything tonight, in the immediate aftermath of an attack, while your emotions are running high, and your judgment may be clouded by fear. I'm not deciding because of fear, Elena said firmly. I'm deciding because these past weeks, getting to know you, getting to know your mother, seeing the world you've built, despite everything working against you, I've realized this isn't the terrifying foreign existence I was afraid it would be. It's complicated, yes. It's dangerous, undeniably. But it's also become something I don't want to walk away from. Draven searched her face carefully, as though testing whether her words carried the weight she seemed to intend. Are you certain? I'm certain that I want to try, Elena said. I'm certain that whatever happens next, I want to face it as someone who chose this world, not someone who was simply thrust into it by circumstance. If your offer still stands, Draven, I accept the bond, not out of obligation, and not out of fear, but because somewhere along the way, without fully realizing it, I've come to care about you, and about this life we could build together. The room fell silent, the distant sounds of security personnel securing the estate, fading into background noise, as Draven closed the remaining distance between them, his hand finally reaching to cup her face gently, as though she were something precious and fragile that he could scarcely believe he was allowed to touch. You honor me beyond anything I deserve, he said quietly. I promise you, Elena, I will spend every day ensuring you never regret this choice. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Margaretha, who had insisted on being brought to Elena's room, despite her guard's objections, her face pale with worry, as she took in the scene before her, the overturned lamp, the tension still evident in the room's atmosphere. Elena, my darling girl, are you truly unharmed? Margaretha asked, rushing forward as quickly as her cane would allow. I'm okay, Elena assured her, embracing the old woman gently. "I'm okay, and I've just told your son something important." Margaretha glanced between the two of them, understanding dawning slowly across her weathered features. "You have decided to accept the bond?" "I have," Elena confirmed. Margaretha's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Elena into a tighter embrace, her voice thick with emotion. "You beautiful, brave girl. You have given this old woman more joy than I thought possible at my age." Despite the danger still lingering in the air, despite the captured intruder being questioned in some secure facility elsewhere on the property, despite the uncertain future that still stretched ahead, a fragile sense of hope settled over the three of them in that moment, a recognition that something significant had been decided, something that would soon need to be declared formally, publicly, before the entire pack and whatever enemies still sought to prevent it. Draven watched Elena carefully as she embraced his mother, a quiet, fierce determination settling over his features. Whatever resistance his counsel might raise, whatever danger his enemies might still pose, he had made his decision weeks ago, and Elena had now made hers as well. What remained was ensuring that the declaration, when it came, would be strong enough to withstand whatever storm followed in its wake. News of the failed attack and Elena's decision to accept the bond spread quickly through the pack's leadership, and within days, Draven called an emergency session of the full council, a much larger gathering than the private meeting held weeks earlier. Representatives from every major faction filled the chamber, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile, murmurs rippling through the room as Draven entered with Elena at his side, her chin lifted despite the obvious nervousness in her eyes. Percival, still visibly skeptical, rose first to address the assembly. "Before this council formally acknowledges any declaration, I believe it is only fair that this young woman understand fully what she is agreeing to, and that this council understand fully who she is." "That is reasonable," Draven said evenly. "Ask what you wish." Percival turned to Elena, his gaze assessing. "You have no pack affiliation, no political training, no experience with the complexities of leadership within our world. Should Draven's enemies target you again, and they will, given what you now represent, do you believe yourself capable of withstanding that pressure?" Elena felt her heart pounding, but she forced herself to meet Percival's gaze directly, refusing to shrink beneath his scrutiny. "I don't have your experience, that's true. I've never led anything larger than a diner shift, but I've spent my entire adult life caring for my family with almost nothing, working through exhaustion and fear, because giving up was never an option. I know what it means to protect the people I love, even when it's difficult, even when it costs me something. I think that matters more than political training." A murmur swept through the chamber, some council members exchanging surprised glances at the conviction in her voice. Isolde, who had expressed reservations during the earlier private meeting, studied Elena with renewed interest. "You understand," Isolde said, "that accepting this bond means accepting permanent danger, not simply during this current conflict, but for the remainder of your life. Our enemies will always view you as a vulnerability to exploit." "I understand that," Elena said. "I've already faced that danger twice now, and both times, I chose to stand rather than run. I don't expect that choice to become easier, but I don't intend to abandon it either." Draven watched her with quiet pride, resisting the urge to intervene, understanding intuitively that Elena needed to face this scrutiny on her own terms, to prove to the council, and perhaps to herself, that she belonged in this world through her own strength rather than his protection alone. Percival remained silent for a long moment, clearly weighing her words against his own reservations, before finally inclining his head slightly. "Your courage is evident. I will grant you that. Whether courage alone is sufficient for the demands of this position remains to be seen. But I will not stand in the way of a decision our Alpha has clearly already made, nor one you have now confirmed for yourself." Other council members voiced their own questions and concerns over the following hour, some pointed and skeptical, others more curious than hostile, and Elena answered each with the same steady honesty, refusing to pretend expertise she did not possess, while standing firm in the values and character that had brought her to this moment. Slowly, gradually, the atmosphere within the chamber began to shift, skepticism softening into cautious acceptance, though not universal support. By the time the session concluded, Draven had secured, if not enthusiastic endorsement, at least the council's formal acknowledgement that the declaration would proceed. As they left the chamber together, Elena finally allowed herself to exhale the breath she felt she had been holding throughout the entire proceeding. That was terrifying, she admitted. You handled it remarkably well, Draven said, pride evident in his voice. Better than many seasoned leaders would have. I meant every word I said, Elena replied, but that doesn't mean it wasn't terrifying. Their conversation was interrupted by Callum, who approached with urgent news, his expression tense in a way that immediately drew both their attention. We have identified the leader behind the attacks, Callum said. A rival faction leader named Osric Vane, who has long opposed Draven's leadership and sought to destabilize the pack through targeted violence. Our intelligence suggests he is growing desperate following the failure of 2 attempts, and may attempt something more direct and immediate. What kind of direct action? Draven asked sharply. We believe he may attempt to disrupt the formal declaration ceremony itself, understanding that a public attack during such a significant event would cause maximum damage to your authority and to pack morale, Callum said. Elena felt a fresh wave of apprehension settle over her, though she forced herself to remain composed. So the ceremony itself could become a target. It is a possibility we must prepare for, Draven confirmed, which means security for the event will need to be more extensive than we initially planned. Over the following days, preparations for the formal declaration ceremony intensified, security personnel coordinating extensively to identify and neutralize potential threats, while Draven and Elena continued deepening their understanding of one another amid the mounting tension. Margareta threw herself into helping Elena navigate the unfamiliar customs and expectations of pack ceremony, patiently explaining traditions, teaching her about the symbolic gestures and words that would be expected of her during the formal declaration. You need not memorize everything perfectly, Margaret reassured her during one such lesson, noticing Elena's growing anxiety over the complexity of the ceremony. What matters most is sincerity, Elena. The pack will forgive imperfect execution of tradition far more readily than they will forgive insincerity. I just don't want to embarrass Draven, or make things harder for him with the council, Elena said. You could never embarrass him, Margareta said firmly. You have already proven, in that council chamber, that you possess more genuine strength than many who have spent their entire lives within our world. Trust in that strength, Elena. It will carry you through whatever comes. Despite the reassurance, Elena could not entirely shake the anxiety building within her as the ceremony date approached, compounded by the ongoing threat of Osric Vane and his faction, whose intentions remained frustratingly difficult to fully anticipate, despite the pack's extensive intelligence network. She found herself training more seriously with the security team assigned to her protection, determined to never again feel as helpless as she had during the intruder's attack on her bedroom, learning basic self-defense techniques and familiarizing herself with the estate's security protocols. Draven, observing her dedication, found his admiration for her deepening further, recognizing in her willingness to prepare and adapt the same fierce resilience that had first drawn him to her in that hospital room weeks earlier. Their relationship, born from crisis and tradition, had grown into something neither of them had initially anticipated, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and, though neither had yet spoken the word aloud, something that increasingly resembled love. The night before the ceremony, Elena stood in her bedroom, examining the elegant garment Margareta had helped select for the occasion, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong the following day. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Draven standing in the hallway, his expression unusually uncertain. I wanted to see you before tomorrow, he said, to ensure you are still certain about this path, given everything that has happened, everything that may yet happen. I'm certain, Elena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Scared, yes, but certain. I am scared as well, Draven admitted, a rare vulnerability in his voice. Not of the ceremony itself, or even of Osric Vane's threats. I am scared of failing to protect you properly, of allowing harm to reach you despite everything I have built to prevent it. Elena reached for his hand, holding it firmly. We'll face whatever comes together. That's what tomorrow is really about, isn't it? Not just tradition, but choosing to stand together against whatever the world throws at us. Draven studied her for a long moment, something fierce and tender passing across his features. Yes, he said finally, that is exactly what tomorrow is about. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, drawing strength from each other's presence, both aware that the following day would bring not only a formal declaration of the bond that had grown between them, but very possibly a confrontation with the enemies, determined to prevent it from ever being completed. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a clear sky and a tension that hung over the estate like a held breath. Security personnel had been positioned throughout the grounds since before dawn, their numbers far exceeding what any previous pack ceremony had required, a stark reminder that this celebration carried genuine danger alongside its significance. Elena stood in front of a mirror as Margareta helped adjust the final details of her elegant gown, a deep green fabric that Margareta insisted matched the color Draven's family had worn in ceremonies for generations, a subtle nod to tradition that Elena found herself grateful for, given how much of the rest of the day's customs still felt unfamiliar to her. "You look radiant," Margareta said, studying Elena's reflection with unmistakable pride. "My son is a fortunate man." "I keep waiting to feel ready," Elena admitted, smoothing the fabric nervously. "But I don't think that feeling is coming." "Readiness is overrated," Margareta said with a small smile. "Courage rarely announces itself with confidence, Elena. Usually, it simply shows up despite the fear, and does what needs to be done anyway. You have already proven you possess that kind of courage. Today will be no different." A soft knock interrupted them, and Callum entered, his expression carrying the particular tension of a man managing multiple concerns at once. "Everything is in position," he reported. "Our intelligence has not identified any specific breach in security, but Osric Vane's whereabouts remain unconfirmed. We are proceeding with maximum caution." "Thank you, Callum," Margareta said. "We will be ready shortly." As Callum departed, Elena felt her earlier nervousness sharpen into something closer to genuine fear, the reality of the ongoing threat settling over her more heavily, now that the ceremony was truly underway. Margareta seemed to sense the shift immediately, taking Elena's hands in her own. "Whatever happens today, know that you have already given this family more than we could ever repay," Margareta said gently. "You saved my life without hesitation, without knowing anything about who I was. Whatever comes next, that courage will not fail you now." Elena nodded, drawing strength from the older woman's steady presence, and together they made their way toward the ceremony grounds, an open courtyard within the estate that had been transformed with careful decoration, simple and elegant rather than ostentatious, reflecting Draven's preference for substance over spectacle. Members of the pack had gathered in significant numbers, filling the courtyard with a low murmur of conversation that quieted as Elena entered, escorted by Margareta. She could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly supportive, and she forced herself to walk with the same steady determination she had displayed before the council weeks earlier. Draven stood at the front of the courtyard, dressed in formal dark clothing that seemed to emphasize the quiet authority he carried, and when his eyes found Elena's across the crowd, something in his expression softened, a genuine warmth breaking through his usually composed demeanor. The ceremony began with traditional words spoken by an elder pack member, invoking the ancient customs surrounding the shielded bond, explaining to the gathered crowd, many of whom had likely never witnessed such a ceremony in their lifetimes, the significance of what was about to occur. Elena listened carefully, following the rehearsed movements Margareta had taught her, though her attention remained partially fixed on the crowd, some instinct keeping her alert to any sign of danger. It was during the final portion of the ceremony, as Draven began speaking the formal words of declaration, that the disturbance began. A commotion erupted near the courtyard's edge, shouts and the sound of scuffling breaking the solemn atmosphere, and within seconds, chaos rippled through the gathered crowd as several armed figures emerged, having somehow breached the extensive security perimeter. Elena's heart lurched, old instincts from the diner attack flooding back immediately, but this time she was not caught entirely unprepared. Draven moved instantly, positioning himself between Elena and the emerging threat, his own guards rushing forward to intercept the attackers, while other security personnel worked to control the panicking crowd. Elena, rather than freezing or fleeing, found herself moving with a clarity born from the weeks of training she had undertaken since the intruder's attack on her bedroom, pulling Margareta backward toward a more protected position near the courtyard's stone wall, shielding the older woman with her own body once again, though this time with far greater awareness of what she was doing and why. The confrontation was brief but intense, Draven's security forces, having anticipated some form of disruption, responding with swift and coordinated efficiency. Osric Vane's attackers, though initially successful in breaching the perimeter, found themselves quickly outmatched and outnumbered. Several subdued within moments, others retreating in a panicked scramble that Draven's forces pursued relentlessly. Draven himself confronted one attacker directly, a brief but decisive exchange that ended with the man restrained and disarmed, Draven's expression carrying a controlled fury that spoke to exactly how seriously he took any threat against those gathered to witness this significant moment in his life. Within minutes, the immediate danger had passed, security personnel securing the perimeter fully and beginning the process of questioning those captured, while the shaken crowd slowly began to settle from the chaos of the interruption. Draven made his way immediately to Elena and his mother, relief evident in his expression upon finding them both unharmed. "Are you both safe?" he asked urgently. "We're safe," Elena confirmed, though her heart still raced from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "Margaretha, are you all right?" "I am unharmed, thanks entirely to you, once again," Margaretha said, her voice trembling slightly, though her eyes shone with fierce pride, rather than fear. Draven turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, despite the recent chaos. This attack, like the ones before it, was orchestrated by those who fear what genuine courage and loyalty represent. They sought to disrupt this ceremony, to prove that even within these walls, none of us are truly safe. But they have failed, as they will continue to fail, because this pack does not bow to fear, and neither do I. A ripple of renewed determination swept through the crowd, murmurs of support growing louder as the initial shock of the disruption gave way to something closer to resolve. Percival, standing near the front of the gathered assembly, stepped forward, with an expression that had shifted noticeably from his earlier skepticism. "The young woman shielded your mother once again, without hesitation, in the midst of genuine danger," Percival said, addressing the crowd as much as Draven himself. "I confess, I harbored doubts about this bond when it was first proposed. I harbor them no longer." Draven turned back to Elena, and despite the chaos that had just unfolded, despite the ongoing danger that Osric Vane's faction clearly still posed, there was a quiet certainty in his expression that had not wavered throughout the entire ordeal. "Shall we finish what we started?" he asked her gently. Elena, still catching her breath, still processing the fear and adrenaline of the recent confrontation, found herself nodding without hesitation. "Yes, let's finish it." The ceremony resumed, the crowd settling into renewed attentiveness, security personnel maintaining heightened vigilance around the courtyard's perimeter, as Draven completed the formal words of declaration, his voice steady and unwavering despite everything that had just transpired. Elena spoke her own portion of the ceremony, the words Margaretha had patiently taught her over recent days, her voice growing stronger with each phrase, until finally, the elder pack member overseeing the ceremony pronounced the bond formally recognized, sealed not only by tradition, but by the courage both Elena and Draven had displayed in the face of genuine danger. A cheer rose from the gathered crowd, considerably more enthusiastic than the cautious murmurs that had greeted Elena's arrival earlier, and Draven pulled her into an embrace that spoke of relief, pride, and a growing depth of feeling neither of them had fully articulated until this moment. "We did it," Elena whispered. "We did," Draven agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And we will continue facing whatever comes, together." As the ceremony concluded, and the gathered crowd began to disperse into a more relaxed celebration, Callum approached with updates on the captured attackers, information that would prove crucial in finally dismantling Osric Vane's faction once and for all. But for this moment, amid the aftermath of danger successfully overcome, Elena allowed herself simply to feel the significance of what had just occurred, the formal recognition of a bond that had begun, weeks earlier, with a single act of instinctive courage in an ordinary diner, and had now culminated in her formal acceptance into a world she had never imagined becoming part of, standing beside a man who had earned not only her gratitude, but her genuine, hard-won love. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, the information gathered from the captured attackers proved decisive. Callum's team traced the funding and coordination behind the assaults directly back to Osric Vane, and armed with concrete evidence of his role in orchestrating repeated attacks against pack leadership, Draven moved swiftly and decisively, to bring the matter before the wider council of regional leaders, presenting proof that left little room for Vane's remaining allies to defend him. Isolated and exposed, Vane's faction crumbled within a matter of weeks, his most loyal supporters abandoning him once it became clear that his campaign against Draven had failed entirely, and that continued association with him carried only risk without any remaining benefit. For the first time since the attack at the Cedar Spoon Diner, Elena found herself able to breathe without the constant undercurrent of fear that had shadowed nearly every day since that ordinary morning had turned extraordinary. Security around the estate gradually relaxed to more standard levels, though Draven, ever cautious, insisted certain protective measures remain permanently in place, a decision Elena had come to understand and accept as simply part of the world she now belonged to. Life settled into a new rhythm over the following months, one that Elena could scarcely have imagined during her years of exhausting shifts at the diner. She continued visiting Miles regularly, ensuring their bond remained strong despite her changed circumstances, and Draven made certain Miles had access to whatever education and opportunities he wished to pursue, never as a means of buying loyalty, but simply as an extension of the genuine care he had come to feel for Elena's family. Margareta, meanwhile, blossomed in her role as something between mother-in-law and dearest friend, spending countless afternoons with Elena in the estate's gardens, teaching her not only the customs and history of the pack, but sharing wisdom accumulated across 72 years of a life that had known both great joy and profound loss. Their bond, forged in that terrifying moment at the diner, only deepened with time, becoming one of the most cherished relationships in both their lives. Elena also found herself gradually stepping into a role within the pack that surprised even her, discovering a natural talent for connecting with people from all walks of life, a skill honed through years of waitressing that translated unexpectedly well into the delicate diplomacy required of her new position. She began working alongside Draven on initiatives to support pack members who, like her own family once had, struggled with poverty or lacked access to proper resources, drawing on her own experiences to advocate for changes that many within the traditional leadership structure had never previously considered. Percival, once her most vocal skeptic, became in time one of her most steadfast supporters, impressed by the genuine dedication she brought to her responsibilities, and the two developed an unlikely but genuine mutual respect that surprised nearly everyone who had witnessed their earlier, more contentious exchanges. Draven, for his part, found himself transformed in ways he had not anticipated when he first declared the bond in that hospital room, weeks after the initial attack. The isolation he had carried throughout years of leadership gradually eased, replaced by a genuine partnership with someone who challenged him, supported him, and understood him in ways few others ever had. His leadership grew steadier, more grounded, informed by Elena's perspective, and the reminder she provided that true strength often lived in compassion rather than calculation alone. One evening, nearly a year after that fateful morning at the Cedar Spoon Diner, Elena stood once again in the estate's garden, watching the sun set behind the tall hedges that had once felt like a cage but now felt simply like home. Draven found her there, as he often did during these quiet evening hours, and settled beside her on the familiar stone bench where so much of their early understanding had first taken root. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Elena asked, watching the last golden light fade across the horizon. "The diner, the attack, everything that followed?" "Often," Draven admitted. "It is strange to consider how a single moment, a single choice, can reshape an entire life. Several lives, in truth. I keep thinking about how ordinary that morning felt right up until it wasn't," Elena said. "I never imagined pouring tea for your mother would lead to any of this." Draven reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with the easy familiarity of a bond that had grown far beyond its formal beginnings. "I am endlessly grateful it did, however unexpected the path here has been." "Me too," Elena said, and found, as she looked out over the garden that had become so familiar, that she meant it completely, without reservation, without the fear or uncertainty that had once accompanied every thought of this unexpected life. "I used to think courage meant not being afraid, but I think I understand it differently now. It's choosing to act despite the fear, and then discovering, sometimes, that the choice leads somewhere you never could have imagined." Draven pressed a gentle kiss to her hand, his expression carrying the quiet, settled contentment of a man who had found something he had not realized he was searching for. "Whatever comes next, Elena, I am grateful every day that you chose to act that morning, and that you have continued choosing this path," and me, ever since. I'll keep choosing it, Elena said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky above them. For as long as you'll have me. Then it seems, Draven said, a rare, genuine smile spreading across his features, that we have found ourselves rather permanently bound together, in the very best possible way. They sat together as darkness settled fully over the garden, two people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by a single moment of instinctive courage, now bound not simply by ancient tradition or formal declaration, but by a love that had grown slowly, genuinely, through shared danger, honest conversation, and the quiet, steady choice to stand beside one another, regardless of whatever challenges still lay ahead. What had begun as an ordinary shift at a small-town diner had become the foundation of an extraordinary life, proof that sometimes the most significant transformations begin not with grand plans or calculated ambitions, but with a single, selfless act of courage, offered without hesitation, to a stranger who needed protecting.